First of all, right now in California's public schools, English learners are nearly a quarter of the student population. And this is meant to be a temporary assignment of status. Students are supposed to be English learners while they are acquiring the skills that they need to succeed in unsupported academic instruction. And the goal of English learner instruction in the program is to actually move students to reclassification and beyond. We see in our research, and many others before us have as well, that English learners lag other kinds of students in the school systems, but that students who are reclassified do very well indeed. And that when we're talking about these kinds of measures, we mean things like test scores and graduation and dropping out. So when policymakers see that reclassified students do so much better than English learners, there's a real interest and emphasis on what we can do to maybe quicken the pace of reclassification while making sure it's still successful for students. So that's one reason why reclassification is such an important issue now and as it has been in the past, but also there are a number of reforms right now in the K-12 educational system that have focused our efforts and energies on reclassification as an important issue. And the first one is the local control funding formula, which is being implemented right now, where now English learner students as well as low-income students generate extra dollars for the district. And that's a weighted formula, giving an additional 20% in funding for each of these students. If the student population is greater than 55% or 55% or greater in a district, there's even concentration funding. So we're emphasizing English learners as an important subgroup in the way that we're funding them now. The new funding streams are going to come with some accountability for spending and actually for outcomes for these students, but what that is exactly going to look like is rolling out right now. And we know that English learners will be followed as a group in the accountability framework with the local control, with the local accountability plans, and so will reclassification rates. There's a bill right now, Senator Padilla, SB 1108, that is interested in actually trying to add reclassified students to the accountability measures, and we'll see what happens with that, but this is definitely getting some policy focus. And another important reform that's going on all at the same time is the implementation of the Common Core state standards and changes in assessments that we use to follow our progress with students. Now, these are important to English learner students for the same reasons that they are to the rest of the student population. There is some additional concern that the potential new rigor or extra rigor of the standards and the assessment might be more difficult for English learners than for native English speakers. But also important for the English learner group is the fact that the assessments we have been using to assess if a student is ready to be reclassified are being phased out, and the replacement is not all the way phased in yet. So this means we have another reason to be paying attention to what's going on with English learners in reclassification right now. So what I want to do is just give you a brief outline of what we're going to talk about today and then get into it. So we'll talk about the reclassification policies in 2 districts that we're studying in detail. Those are Los Angeles Unified and San Diego Unified, and I'll also give you a little bit of background about the student population in each of those districts. And then we'll get into the research questions that this report addresses. And they are how reclassified students fare in the long term, what the association is between more rigorous reclassification standards and student outcomes as compared to less rigorous standards, and also which of the current criteria that we use to reclassify students appear to be the most useful for predicting which students are going to do well. Okay, we focus on long-term academic outcomes in both Los Angeles Unified and San Diego Unified, and these are the 2 largest school districts in the state. Together, about 15% of the state's English learners are found in those 2 districts. And what we do in these 2 districts is we get student-level data from the districts where we can follow students when they start as English learners in 2nd grade and stay with them until what would be their 12th grade year if they're making on-time progress. So we have cohorts of students from Los Angeles and one cohort from Los Angeles and 2 from San Diego Unified. That gives us about 23,000 students in Los Angeles that were ever English learners. So they started with us in 2nd grade, and we can follow them to the end and see if they're English learners or if they're reclassified. and our number for San Diego is about 4,300. So this is a substantial number of students, obviously a fraction of the state, but an important set to be looking at here. Let me tell you a little bit about the demographic composition of the two districts and the students that we're studying. Obviously, Los Angeles Unified is much larger than San Diego. They educate about 650,000 students in any given year, and San Diego Unified has about 130,000 students. Then within the English learner population in LA versus San Diego, both of the school districts have a predominance of Spanish speakers among their English language group. In LA Unified, it's about 94% of the English learners are Spanish speakers. In San Diego Unified, it's about 3/4 of the English learners are Spanish speakers. And then once we go down to the next three languages, there's a little bit of variation between the two districts. In LA, those next most common languages are Armenian, Filipino, and Korean. And in San Diego, it's Vietnamese, Filipino, and Somali. There's more diversity of language spoken in San Diego, as you can see by the the percentage that speak one of those four languages in each of the two districts. So when we talk about the top four languages in LA, we're already talking about 97% of English learners. And in San Diego, we're only talking about 88%. The two districts have a similar share of the population that are currently English learners, about 1/4 in each. And in Los Angeles, there's a greater proportion of students that have either been reclassified or were assessed at the beginning of school entry and determined to be fluent English proficient. So this second from the last row refers to students who are both reclassified and students who were already English proficient when they started but spoke another language at home. Now, Los Angeles is slightly more likely or somewhat more likely to have low-income students, with about over 3/4 of students in Los Angeles Unified being low-income as measured by free and reduced price lunch. And in San Diego, that percentage is about 60%. And sort of generally overall, the demographic picture in Los Angeles is more Hispanic, less white, and less likely to be Asian American than in San Diego. Now I'll talk a little bit about what the reclassification policies are in each of the two districts and highlight how where they veer from the minimum recommendations from the State Board of Education. Both of them have requirements that are more rigorous than the State Board's recommendation. The State Board, there are 4 criteria that districts need to use to reclassify students, and they relate to English proficiency and basic skills and teacher evaluations, as well as parental involvement and consultation. We only talk about the first 3, not the parental component, because there really are not differences as reported by the two districts. And so we focus on the 3 that we can measure and that are different. The English proficiency measure that are similar in one way and different in another in the two districts. Both LA Unified and San Diego Unified use the CELDT, which really, I think all districts do, and they both require an overall score of early advanced or higher on the CELDT. LA allows intermediate scores, as many as you can get and still get an overall score of early advanced. That's probably only 2 in practice, but San Diego limits that to 1 intermediate test. When it comes to basic skills, LA uses the CST English Language Arts portion and requires a score of 300 or more in order to be reclassified. In San Diego, they require 333 or more, but that's just for elementary school reclassification. At older grades, which is not where we're focusing, the threshold is lower. Now here's what we think, with all the work that we've done, turns out to be the biggest difference, which is the way that teacher evaluation is factored into the reclassification decision in LA versus San Diego. Los Angeles, when we were focusing on these students in the early 2000s, required 2 sets of grades. They required grades on English language arts courses to be a 3 or higher on a 4-point scale, and they also required math grades to be a 3 or higher on a 4-point scale. And San Diego Unified didn't use grades at all. The teacher's evaluation was considered, but there's no hard and fast set of rules about what that cutoff was. Now, after the school year of 2005-2006, Los Angeles got rid of its math requirement. The English language arts requirement is still in place in Los Angeles. San Diego's reclassification requirements remain the same as this is their current practice right now, and LA Unified has dropped the math one. When we looked at the overall data that's available on CDE's website or anywhere to look at reclassification rates, we found that there's a strong association between reclassification rates in Los Angeles and their use of this math requirement. So in 2001, 2002, LA reclassified about 10% of their students every year. But now that the math requirement's gone, they're reclassifying more like 13.5%, 14% of their students in a given year. During the same period, San Diego's reclassification rate has been about 10.5% the whole time. So now let's get into the data. And in talking to a reporter yesterday, I was told that this is a little wonky. And I'm going to try to make it less wonky, but I would definitely invite your clarifying questions if you have any as I'm going through this. We'll try to save kind of broader policy questions for later on, but if I have a term that's not making sense, please stop me, and I want to make sure I explain it. Okay, so as I mentioned, or I hope I mentioned, we're focusing on elementary school reclassifications. We have these students and we can observe them for 11 years, but we really want to focus on the long-term outcomes for reclassified students. So we want to see them be reclassified early and then follow them over the long haul. So what we've done is focus on reclassifications that take place before the end of elementary school. So we've got young people who are reclassified before the end of 5th grade. We call them RFEP5. We have English learner students who have not been reclassified by the end of 5th grade, 5, not 3, and they're EL5. And in the top row here, we combine them. So ever-El refers to all of our students who started with us in the 2nd grade, and we have divided them. In the first row, they're not divided. In the second 2 rows, we've divided them into students who didn't reclassify by the end of elementary school and students who did reclassify by the end of elementary school. So that's the term definition. Now I want to get into the data of the slide itself. So we have here in the rows the demographic groups where we've divided up English learners and RFEP students. And in the columns, we're talking about test score data. The first set of test score data is for the CELDT, which is to measure English proficiency. And the second is the CST ELA, which is to measure basic skills. These are the 2 main exams or the 2 main criteria that are used in reclassification decisions. We look at the ever-El group in LA and in San Diego, and we see 2.7 and 2.5 for the ever-El group with the CELDT scores. It's pretty comparable. It's sort of an overall score on the CELDT. And then when we compare the CST results, which is this is the share that are scoring basic or above on the ELA portion of the CST, they're also nearly identical, 49 versus 48%. But then when we take into account how the 2 groups are divided into reclassified and not reclassified in the 2 districts, we see really stark differences. So it's the same students that we see in the top row. Now in the bottom 2 rows have been divided into those that are reclassified and not. And what we see is that in Los Angeles, the scores are much higher than they are for the students in San Diego. So EL5 students on the CELDT are scoring 2.4 on average, and in Los Angeles are scoring 2.4, and in San Diego, 2.1. Big difference, the same kids, just divided differently. And the RFEP5 students, it's the same story. Nearly 3.5% are scoring above, are scoring 3.5 is the score, not percent, sorry. And the other score is 3.1. And we think what's going on here is really about where the line is, what the criteria are for being reclassified. Students who are above that, in LA, the criteria are more difficult, and so the students who are above that cut point have higher scores. Then the same thing, the students who don't get reclassified are actually performing very well, so that brings up the average of the English learner group. In San Diego, the reclassification criteria are less rigorous, is what we think is going on. We'll come back to this issue as we move on. Yes?
I wanted to clarify the cohort that you
Yeah.
So they started 2nd grade, they go to 5th grade, so you didn't count students that were flowing in and out of those grades, so it was like a stable population?
That's right. It's a stable group that we have them with us in 2nd grade, and they come with us all the way to the end, to what would be their 12th grade year if they're making on-time progress. We did do some work to look at the students who we had and then they left to see, while we last saw them, how different did they appear to be on some of these measures that we're going to talk about later. And the differences are not dramatic at all. So we feel confident saying that this is a these set of results apply to, to this cohort probably generally with some slight modifications. We definitely also don't pick up the new arrivers.
And just to clarify, what proportion of the EL population in the school districts does that represent?
I think that it represents about half of the cohort. Does that sound right? Yeah, about half of the cohort. So if you start with a young group, how many of them are still with us? Okay, let's see. Any questions, clarifications about this slide before I move on? Okay. Okay, now we'll get into the results where we're actually trying to understand what the long-term outcomes are for the reclassified students. And I'm going to spend some time on this potentially wonkish slide as well. In this slide, we are combining a lot of different data to show hopefully one cohesive picture. Again, we're starting with these same students and we're following them over time. So we'll pick a line and we're going to, well, you can't see that if I point there. Let's try this. Yeah, that's a mystery. Okay. So I'll start with this line here. So this is second grade test scores for English learners in San Diego. And then there's the same English learners who are taking the test a year later. Here's what's happening to this cohort of students' scores. So these are the same students. We are depicting Los Angeles in dashed lines and San Diego in solid lines. And we're doing our same division where we're looking at English learner students who remained English learner students through the end of 5th grade, reclassified students who were reclassified by the end of 5th grade, and we're looking at their scores at each grade level. And we also have native English speakers on there to point out some interesting differences between the two districts. So native English speakers in both cases are in a greenish tint. LA's are dash, San Diego's are solid. English learners are both orange, LA's dash, San Diego's solid. And most interesting, I think, is the green lines, which are reclassified students in both districts. The solid line is San Diego, and the dash line is LA. You can see that the greenish one for the reclassified students is very high for both districts. In fact, in Los Angeles Unified, the reclassified students are actually outperforming native English speakers. And in San Diego, they're about comparable to the native English speakers in their own district. The EL students in both districts are very similar, performing at about the same levels in terms of their English language arts performance on the CST. So the differences between groups are one thing I want people to take away from the slide. And the other thing that I'd like people to take away from this slide is that reclassified English learners do well, and they continue to do well all the way through the end of high school. Any kind of faltering, or not faltering, any kind of decline in their scores that you see starting out in 10th grade is also mirrored in the native English-speaking population. So test scores for CST go down a little bit at the end of high school, but that's not about your English learner status. That's just what's going on for all high schoolers. So this slide tells us that RFEP students are doing very well and that they don't falter. And in LA Unified, RFEP students are doing even better than native English speakers. In San Diego, they're doing about comparably well when it comes to the CST ELA. This next slide is a similar story, but a different measure. Here we're looking at what kind of on-time grade progress students are making when they go all the way to high school. So again, these are students who either were or were not reclassified by the end of 5th grade. And we're comparing them to native English speakers. So in LA Unified, it's again the RFEP students who are doing the best of these three groups. And in San Diego Unified, the RFEP and native English speaking groups are pretty comparable. We have gotten a lot of questions about what goes on after 9th grade and between 9th grade in particular and 10th grade, which we're not showing here, but all the way to 12th grade. What happens? Why do so many students seem to fall off the on-time grade progression track after 9th grade? And it seems that starting in high school, it's about credit accumulation. So while in elementary school, maybe failing one class doesn't necessarily hold you back from the whole grade, you're not retained. If you don't have enough credits after your 9th grade year, you will be still called a ninth grader. So some students catch up from this and some don't, but this is where we start to see it fall off, is after the ninth grade. English learner students who have not been reclassified, which is EL5, those students are faring the worst in both districts. And then when we go from the next step from just whether are you on time or not by 12th grade to whether or not you've graduated, we see the same patterns by group are holding. And I don't want San Diego representatives or people who like LA to think that this means that Los Angeles is doing a great job and San Diego is doing a crummy job when it comes to graduation requirements. As districts can have their own reclassification requirements, they can also have their own graduation requirements. San Diego requires 2.0 and 3 years of math and 3 years of science, and LA doesn't have that same level of requirement. So things are looking pretty good for San Diego students in terms of on-time grade progression, but when you layer in their graduation requirement, it looks like this is where some students don't make the cut. Yeah.
Does your EL5 group mean they weren't reclassified by 5th grade still, or are these people who are still ELs at graduation?
These are students who were not reclassified by the end of 5th grade, so some of them could have been reclassified 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th. Yeah. That would be a different, much worse demographic look, I think, if we were looking at students who are still English learners at the end of 12th grade, and in fact, I think there are many fewer of them because they leave later in high school. Yes?
Does your, does your RFEP5 include initially for?
No. Yeah, that's a good question. The RFEP5 students are all students who began as English learners. So they took the home language survey, they got whatever, they answered whatever answer, filtered them into taking the CELDT. When they took the CELDT, their initial score on it classified them as English learners. Later on, in elementary school, they became RFEP students. Our report does have, in the technical appendix, some comparisons with students who were initially fluent, but we don't present those here today. And then our final long-term indicator long-term academic outcome that we're going to talk about today is passing the CAHSEE. So almost all RFEP students are passing the CAHSEE by 12th grade. And in fact, many of them pass it the first time they take it in 10th grade. In LA Unified, it's over 90%, and in San Diego, it looks like it's close. It's probably high 80s or almost 90%. And there's a lot of catch-up for taking it later on, especially among English learners who start pretty low in 10th grade, but do catch up, but they're still not performing as well as native English speakers, obviously. And in both cases, both districts, students who are reclassified by the end of 5th grade are more likely to pass the CAHSEE, it looks like, by the end of 12th grade than are native English speakers. So a few other things that I don't have the slides to show today because we wanted to let you go before 2. We did also look at how this varied or didn't vary by language spoken, and we found in both cases that Spanish-speaking English learners performed well, still, not as well as some of the other language groups within English learners. They still, in Los Angeles, performed as well as native English speakers, Spanish-speaking EL reclassified students. And in San Diego, they didn't perform as well as native English speakers. We also found that students who were, again, where our focus is on elementary school reclassification, but if students were reclassified, say, in 3rd grade as opposed to 5th grade, their outcomes were a little bit better. Being reclassified early, it seems to be associated with doing well later. That doesn't mean it causes it, but it's associated with it. So we looked at that as well. And the thing that I want to take away from this section is that students who are reclassified in elementary school do very well, and they don't falter. We don't see any evidence of any kind of loss of this test, the testing on English language arts or in math or in the CAHSEE or grade progression taking place for reclassified students. They're holding on to their positive outcomes. And now I'm going to transition it to Julian, who's going to talk about the rest of the talk.
All right, thank you, Laura. So the next question we asked was, how do these standards actually work in terms of being a binding constraint? We've got the CELDT requirements. There are 4 or 5 of them, depending upon the year. There's a CST requirement as well. So we asked ourselves in these 2 districts, for students who are still English learners in elementary school, what was the binding constraint? What we mean by binding constraint, which was which of these requirements was the one that was most difficult for students to reach? So we're going to start here by showing you results for Los Angeles Unified. And here we're completely ignoring, for the time being, the additional requirements in LA. And again, these are the requirements that students had to score 3 or higher on a 4-point scale on grades in math and English separately. So we're going to ignore that for now. I'll show you what happens in a minute when we add those requirements. So for each grade in Los Angeles, what we're showing you is for students in our cohort who are still English learners, what was the binding constraint. So for instance, in grade 2, we get exactly 70% of students found the reading CELDT requirement to be the binding constraint. In other words, here's the cutoff, and these students were way below that cutoff. You can see that by the very large green bar over on the extreme left of this graph. Obviously, you see changes across the grades. One interesting thing, though, is that the writing CELDT, so the component of the CELDT that tests writing ability, is very rarely a binding constraint. When Karen and I talked to people in San Diego Unified, they were not as surprised by that as you or I might be. They said that actually the writing requirement in the CELDT is fairly straightforward. If you can write short declarative sentences, you will probably do well. It's not so on the reading CELDT. It can be quite tricky. The main change that you see as you watch students progress from grade 2 up to the higher grades is that the CST ELA, given by the orange bars, becomes a binding constraint for more students than the CELDT reading does. And this tends to be in the later grades. Now this is, again, completely ignoring the fact that for this particular cohort, students had to score 3 out of 4 on the standards-based report card in both math and English. So now, let's look at what happens right here when we add in those grades. So the lighter gray bars, those are rows showing the grade requirement and what percentage of students in grades 4 and 5 in LA found listening grades, speaking, reading, and writing grades, or the math grade requirement to be the binding constraint. And you see these numbers are pretty big. 24.8% of students alone in grade 4 found getting grades of 3 or higher out of 4 on writing was really was the binding constraint, was the most difficult barrier that they faced. If you put all these grade requirements together, among grade 4 English learner students in LA, 67.4% of students found the grades, not the CST, not the CELDT, but the grade requirement that's specific to LA Unified to be the binding constraint. The rightmost column shows a similar story for grade 5 students. Here it's even bigger. Instead of 67.4% of students having a binding constraint in terms of the grades, it now goes up to 69.6% of students. So over 2/3 of students who are English learners in LA are finding the grades the problem, not the CELDT requirement, not the CST requirement. Another interesting but more subtle pattern here is that if you look at the math grades row, which is third from the bottom, that's a binding constraint for 16% of students in grade 4, but almost 24% of students in grade 5. We're not sure why that is, but one interpretation of that is that these students are working very hard on their English language skills, and their grades in English go up at a faster rate than their grades in math do. Okay? And again, as Laura has already stated, in the year 2005-2006, after that year, LA Unified decided to no longer require a math grade requirement in the district, and that's probably responsible for an almost 4 percentage point increase in the reclassification rate in that district. Here are the results for San Diego Unified. And again, it hasn't changed its policy over time. It's roughly speaking quite similar to what we see for LA. In the lower grades, the CELDT reading requirement is the main binding constraint. You do see, though, in each of grade, from grade 2 to grade 5, that the CST requirement is a binding constraint for more students in San Diego than you find in LA Unified. And we expected that because, remember, in San Diego, the requirement is higher than the state minimum. You have to be mid-basic on the CST test to be reclassified rather than just basic. Scores of 333 versus 300, and that's why those orange bars are so prominent, especially in grades 4 and 5 in San Diego. In the later grades, there's more or less a balance between CELDT reading and CST in terms of which is more likely to be a binding constraint on students. The next thing we set out to do was to ask, in a sense, are these districts doing the right thing? So in other words, if both of these districts had just used the state minimum requirements, more students would have been reclassified. These districts are not doing that. Why not? Well, because they felt the students needed to be better prepared before English language supports were taken away. So what would happen to students if they were not reclassified? And it's hard to do this because there isn't really an experiment in either district. The first thing we did, shown in this top bullet here, is we took San Diego Unified's 333 CST requirement, which is way above the 300 requirement that LA has, and we applied that to all the students who were reclassified in LA Unified. So now we do have an experiment of sorts. We've got students who actually were reclassified in LA, for whom language supports were taken away, and we can divide all those reclassified students into two groups, those who are above 333 and those who are below 333. And by this, we're hoping to get a sense of how those San Diego students who were below 333 would have done had they been reclassified, when in fact in San Diego they were not. We found small differences in outcomes. As you'd expect, the kids with scores of 333 or higher did a little bit better in middle school on the CST, math, and ELA test, but not by much. I'll show you that in a second. But as a result, though, there's a cost, fewer students are reclassified. Then we did the converse experiment. This one's a little bit trickier. What really distinguishes LA's criteria from San Diego's, as you've seen, is that they require grades of 3 on a 4-point scale on both math and English. How could we possibly know what a San Diego student's grades would have been had he or she been in LA? Well, for that we did a regression analysis where we tried to predict LA student scores on the grade and math GPA scale using their CST scores and their CELDT scores. And we got a pretty good fit from those models. We then used those models and applied them to San Diego students, because we have the same CST and CELDT scores for them, to predict San Diego students' GPAs had they been in LA. We found pretty striking differences here, I must say. We found that 25% of LA students would not have been reclassified based on this 333 cutoff. That's the first experiment up above. This experiment down below, where we're taking San Diego Unified students and asking, okay, of all the students who were reclassified, what percent would not have made the cut in LA? And it ranged by grade between 71 and 93% of reclassified students in San Diego would not have been reclassified in Los Angeles. So that gives you a really, I think, quite tangible sense of just how high the standards were at this period in history in Los Angeles Unified. Returning to this Los Angeles Unified experiment, we found huge differences in outcomes for reclassified students in San Diego based on whether they would have been reclassified or not in LA, almost a full performance level, so almost the difference between being, say, basic versus proficient on the CST, because I just mentioned far fewer students would be reclassified as a result. Essentially in San Diego, maybe 3 out of 10, down to, in some grades, only 1 out of 10 students who are actually reclassified would have been had they been in LA. So here are the gains in performance levels that you would see. On the left here, we're showing for Los Angeles students the difference in math scores, ELA scores in grade 8, that's shown with a green bar over here. That is the difference in math scores between the students who were above 333 and the students who were below. But all of these students were reclassified, and you get about a 0.4 performance level difference. Again, what the scale means here is we decided to scale far below basic, proficient and advanced, just as a numerical scale. So when we see a difference of 0.4, that means that's about 40% of the difference between being basic and proficient. Okay, so there's a difference, but it's not huge. The orange bar over on the left is showing the difference in 7th grade math CST. We don't go higher than that because starting in grade 8, as you probably know, students are taking different math CST test based on what math subject matter they're studying, and you find a similar gap there. Over on the right, this is showing the differences amongst San Diego's reclassified students when we break them up artificially into students who we predict would have been reclassified in LA versus students who would not have been. Huge difference here, about 0.8, 0.9 performance level. So that's all the way between being basic and proficient. So that's quite a big gap, but as I've already told you, our sense is a huge fraction of students were probably being held back in LA when they would have been probably reclassified in San Diego. So our next question here has to do with the predictive ability of reclassification criteria. What on earth do we mean by that? Well, the state's minimum requirements for reclassification involve a CST score on ELA of 300 or higher, and also scoring at certain levels on the CELDT. Do we need both of these criteria in order to identify students who really are ready to be reclassified? And what about LA's idea of using grades as well? So what we did for both districts was to forecast longer-term outcomes. For instance, middle school math and reading scores on the CST, whether students graduate on time, whether they pass the high school exit exam, known as the CAHSEE, on their first attempt in grade 10. And we ran models to predict these things using one of these items at a time. CELDT by itself, GPA by itself, CST by itself, and combining all three together, which is what essentially LA was doing. So let's have a look at those results. Let me explain this a little bit. The vertical axis here is the percent of variation explained in our models. So what this is referring to is how well our models fit. If you had 100%, a bar that was at the height of 100% here, that would mean our explanatory variables can explain all the variation across every single student in our sample. Of course, you're never going to get there. The important thing is to look at, in each quartet of bars here, the relative height of the bars. So let's start way over on the far left with the first quartet of bars. What we're modeling here is written down at the bottom of the screen. This is CST ELA grade 8 proficiency levels. If you look at the gray bar on the right of this quartet of bars, that shows that we could explain 45% of the variation across students in their grade 8 CST scores when we used all these things combined. The CELDT subtests, grades, and CST scores. That's pretty darn good, actually. What surprised us was that we didn't need to use all three of those things. In fact, we could do almost as well using one thing alone, and that's shown by the green bar. If you just use the CST ELA score, that could explain almost as much of the variation. The CELDT came in sort of second. That's the orange bar over in the far left. If we just use the CELDT subtest scores themselves, we can explain a little bit over 30% of the variation, which in social science is thought to be a pretty good level of explanatory power. ELA GPA is the sort of brownish black bar. As you can see, it explained the least among these three sets of predictive variables. Now, moving from the leftmost quartet across to the right, next we're looking at CST math scores in grade 7. Almost the same pattern. We can't explain math performance quite as well as we can English performance. That's no surprise, since what we're using here is essentially test scores related to math, to English, not to math. But exactly the same pattern arises. We could explain almost as much as we can with a full model using CSTs and CELDT and grades, just using CSTs by themselves, and the CELDT scores come in sort of second if we had to use just one thing, and grades lag behind. We find the same thing over here in the third quartet in the middle, where we're showing in models of did you pass the California High School Exit Exam, the CAHSEE, on first attempt in grade 10. Again, it's CST scores followed by CELDT that have the most explanatory power. Things change a lot when we look at some of the longer term outcomes. Second from the right, here what we're modeling is whether a student was retained in or before grade 10. So did a student repeat a grade? We have less explanatory power for this than we do for the essentially the test score models to the left. But essentially the same pattern, though, that CST is the winner, although you'll see now that elementary school grades in English language arts has essentially the same explanatory power, which sort of makes sense because what really determines whether students can be held back or not? is grades. If you fail a lot of courses, you'll be held back. And then the rightmost quartet of bars here is looking at our models of whether students graduated on time. In other words, 10 years after we first observed students in LA in grade 2, and we find that just using CST by itself has almost as much explanatory power as does using all three. Grades are close second, and CELDT is close third after that. In San Diego, we get very similar results. Again, what wins the horse race? If you just could put one horse in the race, CELDT, GPA, or CST, it's in general the CST scores, followed by CELDT, and grades, as measured in San Diego, have the least predictive power. The really big difference between this graph and the one I just showed you for LA is the grades have less predictive power in San Diego than in Los Angeles. We think the reason for this is that way back here in the early part of the last decade, LA was already using a standards-based report card where teachers had to look at a set of instructions to decide whether to give a student a 4 or 3 or a 2 or 1. We didn't yet have that in San Diego, we now do. So we think that at the time, teachers had more leeway in assigning grades, and therefore they have less predictive power. The same pattern really emerges. So this is essentially telling us, even though we have 2 hurdles in the state recommended minimum requirements for reclassification, both the CST and the CELDT hurdles, really maybe we could be using just one, and I'll return to that in a minute. So very quickly, conclusions and recommendations. Well, first conclusion, I think in a way the most important finding from this report is that if there's concern out there that language supports are being taken away from English learners too soon, and that because of that they falter, we really find no evidence of that at all in this report. In LA in particular, no matter what outcome we look at, students who are reclassified in elementary school outperform native English speakers, and in some cases quite dramatically. In San Diego, students who are reclassified during the elementary school years perform as well as native English speakers. And that might be perhaps the goal. You could imagine a very egalitarian society saying, if there's a group that's behind, you want to keep supporting that group until they're on a par with the group that's ahead of them. That's essentially what seems to have been happening in San Diego. Second bullet here is that you could use any of these predictors, CST or CELDT or grades. You'd be able to predict middle school and high school outcomes pretty well, although grades are less predictive than the 2 test scores, the CST and the CELDT. This final bullet here we makes, I think, a fundamentally important point. We're at a critical juncture in the history of California education. As you know, the CST wasn't in wide use this year. Next year, smarter balanced assessments will come into play. We've just adopted new English language development standards in California. The CELDT test, as a result, is being redesigned, and there'll be a new one in 2016. So this is a really, really important time for the state to figure out what are the ideal standards for reclassifying students, and what criteria should we use. Should we use a basic skills test? That refers to a test that everybody takes, like the CST or the Smarter Balanced, or should it be an English language proficiency test like the CELDT? Or should it be grades, or should it be all 3? And then we also need to examine, I think, statewide and on a district-by-district level, whether we've set criteria that are too rigorous or not rigorous enough. So with those questions in mind, here's some parting policy recommendations that we came up with. The first is, we really should strongly consider allowing districts to reclassify English learners as fluent English proficient based on strong performance on a single test. And that more or less is what is going to happen this year, since the CST is not being widely used across the state. It's being phased out. So districts really are going to have to use the CELDT. We think that's fine, because the CELDT has a lot of predictive power. If you do well in CELDT, you're likely to do very well in middle school and high school. But even after Smarter Balanced is brought in next year, and even after the CELDT is replaced, I believe in 2016, we may want to consider a statewide policy that if you do well on either of these assessments, that might be enough to reclassify you. 1 hurdle rather than 2 may be enough. Second point, we really need to consider the relative rigor of new tests. I showed you those figures showing that the CELDT writing requirement is not a binding constraint for very many English learners at all. You can interpret that as the reading requirement being too hard or the writing requirement being too easy. But the state really, as it develops a new CELDT replacement, needs to think hard about the relative rigor it should be requiring in reading and writing. Next, we think that individual districts need to think long and hard before they set their own reclassification criteria above the minimum reclassification criteria that the California Department of Education has already recommended to districts. We've been looking in this study at 2 districts which have set more rigorous criteria. And yes, it's true, reclassified students, there were fewer of them in both districts, and they did better than the students who weren't reclassified, who were just a little bit below the cut points. But sizable numbers of students, especially in LA, in this cohort, were held back. They were not put into reclassified status as soon as they could have been. And districts need to think long and hard about whether they're doing that at the right time or whether they're holding students in English learner status essentially for too long. And that might have consequences. If students are taking more English language development classes, they're taking less of something. It could be band, but it could be career and technical education courses. It could be A to G preparatory courses to prepare people for college. We don't know what the cost is, but there is what economists call an opportunity cost of that. Then our final recommendation here is that we as a state really need to think about maybe requiring uniform standards for reclassification for all English learners regardless of the district they're in. It doesn't make a lot of sense to us that in this period here, students in LA faced far more rigorous hurdles than did students in San Diego. You know, love it or hate it, No Child Left Behind required each state to set up standards for proficiency in English and math. And districts don't have the right to say, oh, in our district you need to have slightly higher test scores to be deemed proficient. And no one really protested at that. That's not what's going on with English learners. With English learners, each district decides how long students should be receiving additional language supports before they're reclassified and mainstreamed. And we think that's something that the state of California as a whole really needs to think about. So that's the end of our comments, and we now have time for question and answer. So we'll go sit down over here. I can also...
Just a quick question. Is there a financial incentive with this new formula funding to not reclassify students, to keep them in that English language?
Right. There is, and I believe it's a 20% increase in funding per EL ADA as opposed to non-EL ADAs. And that's another reason, when we state this in the report, why it might be a good idea for the state of California to say, no, we're going to stop this providing you with minimum requirements for reclassification, but making this a uniform standard statewide. That being said, it's been pointed out to us, it was someone we were talking to, that students who are living in poverty also receive a supplement into the local control funding formula. A lot of English learners, even if they are reclassified, will be bringing in additional funding from the state because they're still living in poverty even after they're reclassified in many cases. But you're right, that is an issue.
One of the charts that you showed earlier had native speakers, reclassified, and English learners. And it looked like in grade 2, there were reclassified 5 students who scored higher on the CSTs than native speakers or English learners. And I'm just wondering, did your study include looking into misclassification of English learners who became reclassified? I'm just wondering if they were not true English learners when they were initially identified as English
We
learners.
did not look at that issue. I know that there are policies within each district to try to figure out how they handle that, because that, you know, does happen sometimes. But I think it's hard for students to be reclassified until they get to 2nd grade in each of these districts. And there might be some sort of appeal process if you've been misclassified. But again, we saw that in LA, that reclassified students had higher scores than native English speakers many grades through the trajectory.
You don't see this pattern in San Diego, and I don't think it's because there are fewer misclassification mistakes. It's because the standards at the time were lower than in LA. And so what we're identifying with the RFEP5s, the kids who were English learners who were reclassified by the end of grade 5 in LA, is they're pretty extraordinary students.
I really appreciate that your research suggests that RFEP students, or their academic trajectory is really stable. I'm wondering if you examined at all the percentages or the rates of intervention that those two districts identified for RFEP students. So, for example, we have to follow the students for 2 additional years after reclassification. And it's a question that we've asked in our county of our districts is what percentage of your RFEP students do you identify as needing further intervention, either for content area support or for academic language support? In one of my districts reported, frankly, a surprisingly high intervention number of 32%. And so I'm wondering if your analysis of these 2 districts looked at intervention needs of RFEP students that might explain the stable academic trajectory of these kids.
Do you know anything, Karen, about what they do in San Diego?
I don't believe that we looked at whether or not students data from students who have been reclassified and followed them specifically after they were reclassified. I do know that in San Diego they do follow students. In San Diego and LA both, because the requirements for reclassification were higher than the state minimums. I believe that the students were more well prepared than they would have been had they been reclassified at the lower criteria levels. Because in San Diego, students have to score at the 333 level on the CST. Because students had to have higher grades in Los Angeles, they were generally better prepared for that transition once it happened. I think that's one of the reasons that we believe that when the state reconsiders what the reclassification criteria are, it should be based on data. So a similar analysis should be done on statewide data that we did on San Diego and LA data to find out what that perfect sweet spot is, the most appropriate time for students to be reclassified.
Right. So I can add a little bit to that. So in San Diego, if you're not reclassified and you're in middle school or high school, there's a 1 to 2 year course called the Academic Language Development course, which you would be in. The minute you're reclassified, you will not be taking that class. So that's an example of a pretty substantial support that's being taken away. But your question, I think, was more general about what supports are being given to reclassified students. One program that the district has had for quite a few years now is a set of CAHSEE preparatory classes. It used to be just in grade 11, and it's trickling all the way down to grade 9 now to hone those skills that are being tested in the CAHSEE. And so I would imagine there would be some RFEP students who would be taking those classes. So there are supports, and they would participate to the same extent that native English speakers would, essentially looking at CST scores in grades 8 and 9. To figure out which students should be in those courses.
And I would add also in San Diego, most schools have English language support teachers, and one of the functions of that position is to follow students who have been reclassified to make sure that they're not faltering. So there is someone who's watching out to make sure that they have the supports they need. So it's the continuous monitoring that's important and that is happening as well.
In Los Angeles, I know that they do have a little pot of money that they keep for monitoring RFEP students, but I don't know the extent of what services might be provided or even how big that pot is and what the plans are for it in the future. I think over there next. Alejandro.
Since the reclassification criteria differs in both districts, is there any insight into how each district developed that specific criteria?
That's a good question. I know I can speak about when I was in Los Angeles and presenting our results, that they had kind of independently decided that the math requirement was too rigorous and that they appear to be already kind of wondering if the ELA requirement is too rigorous. And when we presented the binding constraint information that showed, oh, wow, in grades 4 and 5, once you layer on the grades, it's really these grades that are the holdback for the students, and that made them think like, okay, is this really what we're after? And so I saw the back end of it, not the front of it, end of it, but it seems like it is something that's making people think a little bit.
In San Diego, the Office of Language Acquisition did look at the data for students who were reclassified at the 300 versus 333. It had been 300 in San Diego, but they really felt that students at that level were not prepared enough to progress once they got past second and third grade, when they needed actually more literacy skills to be able to acquire the content knowledge. So that's why for the elementary grades, they increased that requirement to 333. Then starting with grade 6, it goes back to 300. But they did it based on looking at data for reclassified students to make sure that they knew when they were well prepared for success.
Good afternoon. Thank you for this report. I had two questions. One is, did you look at all at language pathways as a variable in the students' academics? So were some students in immersion classes, or did you only look at English immersion? Was there any distinction of their academic trajectory?
We didn't do that. There is some research in LA Unified by Karen Thompson and Kenji Hakuda that's doing that, that's looking specifically at bilingual education versus the other programs, and then Sean Reardon's doing that in San Francisco Unified. So we didn't do that, leaving that to the folks who were already started down that path.
Okay, and the second question I had was, you mentioned that the outcomes for English learners were less good for Spanish speakers than other students of other language, other native language. Do you have a hypothesis or set of ideas about why that's the case?
Well, I don't think we know for sure. But we do know in San Diego, the language group that really outperforms the others among ELs is Vietnamese. So there are all sorts of hypotheses about what could be going on there. It could be something to do with neighborhoods, cultural factors, all sorts of different things. And I think that requires more research for us to really know for sure.
I think my question was actually very similar to that. I was curious about, in that cohort of students that were reclassified, like what proportion of the original cohort that was and what the demographic was of those kids. Is there a certain group that's more likely to be reclassified? And I'm just wondering what the impact is on the data. But in addition to that, because it is LAUSD and San Diego, there's a certain type of immigrant population that's going through those parts of the state. So I wondered, in critiquing your own work, what the limitations might be in applying some of those findings to different parts of California, more rural areas with different immigration patterns, populations with much less literacy, maybe more rural areas, no literacy, because we have Hmong populations in the Central Valley. We have populations from regions of Oaxaca, also in the Central Valley and Imperial Valley. So I just wondered, in critiquing your own study, what you think the limitations might be of extrapolating to a statewide policy.
Should I
Go.
start with?
Yes.
Yeah, well, I think San Diego and LA, while they both have a preponderance of Spanish speakers, they do have different language groups. You know, you see the Somali is actually a pretty common, relatively speaking, language spoken in San Diego, which is not at all in Los Angeles. So those two districts, while you might think of them as sort of gateway from the south, that's certainly not the only receiving groups that, we're not receiving just Spanish speakers from Mexico and Central America there. But you're right, there are other, going to be other experiences with English learners in different parts of the state where, you know, there's maybe no literacy whatsoever for folks who are coming from parts of Mexico where indigenous languages are spoken rather than Spanish. So we don't have a good handle on that. But we do have these two very large districts where there are these very large immigrant populations and second-generation immigrant populations that we find in other parts of the state, both urban and rural, both. And PPIC did a report that looked at these reclassification issues statewide, that looked at a survey of reclassification policies and found similar things, that reclassification standards that are higher in other districts are associated with lower reclassification rates, as well as, you know, improved at the margin outcomes for reclassified students. And that those districts included both rural and urban.
So another limitation, which we state in the report, is that we focus on students who arrive in elementary school, essentially because the preponderance of students statewide or English learners do arrive in elementary school. But we would love to study in future work, if we could, late arriving English learners. We think that they face an entirely different set of challenges.
And looking at the four requirements, I know you didn't look at the parental requirement in the guidelines, but before budget cuts, there were programs that were very successful when they enrolled parents with students that were English language learners at the low grade level per second. And by having the parents enrolled in a ESL class, those students seem to do a lot better on the testing. So I was just wondering, although you didn't discuss it today, was there any evidence through this study that you found about successful parental involvement programs that keyed in to some success that was happening in these two districts that you looked at?
I think that's a great question and something that we didn't address in this research, sorry.
We'd love to be able to.
Yeah, I think this better be our last question, so those of you who have other commitments can get on.
I know you didn't test for this, but I've experienced where a child goes from the English learner class to the regular class, and they're so proud of themselves. I just wonder if you could test somehow the stigma that might be associated with being in an EL class, and then when you get out of there, why your socialization and your standing in the class really improves. So I'd love to see that.
Right.
that
There are really two
tested.
things that happen when you get reclassified. One is you don't have the language supports, but also your sense of self might be different. I don't know which direction. And it's something we have ideas for how we would test as well in future work. Well, thank you all for coming today.
Thank you.